It's the Cavaliers Basketball Club Podcast.
It's basketball time at the Cube.
It's over! It's over! The 52-year drought is over! The Cavaliers have won the NBA championship! Cleveland, this is for you!
Mitchell
goes to the basket and buries Cornette.
Garland high steps over the timeline, stumps on a dime, hits the three. Darius Garland has been unreal here in the fourth quarter. Shot clock down to 5. Lillard blocked by Mobley. In the fourth. Vegas challenge Allen, and Allen said no. Get that big stuff out of here.
The shoot-around.
Welcome back to the club. Well, as you all know by now, the Cavs fell to the Knicks in Game 5 on Wednesday night by a score of 106-95. It was more of the same from the previous two games and really the entire series minus Game 2. We've been preaching all season that our expectations really didn't go beyond a playoff berth, but given how we flat out didn't show up to compete against the Knicks, it's hard to not feel dejected about this outcome and frankly, the future of the Cavs at this point. So, how are you feeling, Colin?
I agree with you, Adam. I'm frustrated, and I'm sure everyone is dejected, and you're right. The expectations weren't crazy high for this team, and we know this team is young, but no one thought the Cavs would look this lost and complacent in so many possessions. I know we have a lot to unpack, and so let's dive into this debacle.
We're thrilled that you were listening to our podcast, and instead of an ad about who to bet on and why, I think we all know what I mean, we would like to invite you to subscribe to Apple Podcasts and Spotify to keep following our show. And if you're seeing this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We appreciate the support.
We will unpack the series and why it went so badly, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, but one thing I wanted to get into is the fact that a lot of folks online have been saying that we should get rid of Allen because he only had 4 rebounds in 35 minutes of play in Game 5. So do you think we should move on from the man in the middle and trade him this offseason?
Well, I think that the final 3 games of this series were disappointing across the board for everybody on the team. Should we trade everyone?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my response to those people. Because looking at his stats, I don't see anything dissimilar to what I would find if I looked at Mitchell's stats or Garland's stats or Mobley's stats or anybody's stats. I mean, I know that on the one hand, we've got a few stats we can point to today that show that the core 4 played well. But they didn't. They still played 10 points under what they averaged. They still didn't play the defense that they played throughout the regular season. So they underperformed. That's just what happened. And I think that looking at Allen's stats, he did have 14 boards in the first game and 10 boards in the second game. Come on. I mean, what did people want? He fell off a cliff in games 3, 4, and 5, but the whole team did. And the Knicks did a great job of basically turning our team into a team without an identity. And we talked about that in our previous episode, that they stopped trusting each other, right? And Jackson Flickinger talked about it, that they were not allowing people to go one-on-one defensively because they were constantly coming off of their assignments to help each other out. And that caused a lot of openings for people to get rebounds. I mean, in that final game, Mitchell Robinson had plus 10 offensive boards. I mean, that's ridiculous. And that doesn't come from Jarrett Allen playing poorly. That comes from the entire team playing poorly. Just looking at what Allen had to say about his own play, the lights were brighter than he expected, even for him. And that it's his job, as a starring role on the Cavs, it's his job to control the boards, and he couldn't do it. He said, I shoulder quite a bit of the blame. That's my job to get rebounds. That's my job to box people out. Something that I heard the announcers say before the end of the game, because they were trying to give the crowd, the hometown crowd, something to feel good about, is that they've all been where the Cavs were in that moment. Every single former player that night talking about the Cavs said, this hurts. I know because it happened to me. And what matters is the hunger that you feel, the drive that you feel. You're going to take a few days off and you're going to be right back in working at your game instead of whatever you would have done if it had gone 6 or 7 games and you felt like you actually competed more. Now they've got a big chip on their shoulder. Mm-hmm. And I would say that if they can't meet that next season, then we can start talking about trading people away.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, during the regular season, this was a really good team, and they definitely fell off a cliff in this series. And we'll talk more into the podcast about who should maybe take more blame for that. And the players are going to take blame because they're the ones that are on the floor. And Allen does deserve criticism because, as I mentioned, 4 rebounds that's something that you or I could get in a preseason basketball game with maybe G League talent. So it's not good. And Allen is a guy who is making a decent amount of money. He's on a $100 million contract, and so a lot of folks are going to say, "Oh, he's taking up a lot of cash and roster movement, yada 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 yada." But really, with how much money these leagues make every year, and how the cap is probably going to increase and whatnot, and the flexibility with the new CBA, he's actually a bargain right now. And I expect that he'll just improve, even if he stays where he's at statistically, what he was at the regular season. If he can translate that into the postseason, then he's in really good shape. So I think that he is getting the brunt of it because of how much better the Knicks did on the boards. But again, as you mentioned, that was the number one thing, the gold star, highlighted in yellow, triple underlined on the scouting report, which is the Knicks are going to try to out-rebound you. And that does take a team effort to get them off the boards. It's not just Allen. Allen will take the brunt, and he'll take the blame, and seems to be a gracious enough person to, take that on, but I don't think you trade him just because of the fact that the whole team let down and just looked like garbage in that game when it came to rebounding. So, yeah, I agree. You keep him and you try to utilize his leadership and his actual innate abilities moving forward, as opposed to dwelling on a few bad performances.
Colin, this is definitely not how we wanted the season to end. It's hard to believe it was just 2 weeks ago that we were excited for the playoffs to start. I don't think we expected the Cavs to win in 7 games, but to ultimately lose in 5 feels like a disgrace. Who do you think is to blame for this series' defeat, ultimately?
You and I have talked about this back and forth off air, and we've mentioned it to our friends and family. I think that when you have people who are in our lives outside of the podcast, you vent as much as you can. So I'll try to be as detailed and specific in this and not go off on a diatribe. I think ultimately the blame goes with JB. We did the podcast with Tony and Jackson, and we talked about how we'd like to give JB his flowers, because I do think he's an underrated coach at times. But I think in this instance, I am putting the blame almost solely on him. I do think the players underperformed, but I think that JB did some stuff that wasn't just head scratching, it was anti the success of the team. When you look at how he kept putting Karras in the starting lineup, well, okay, it worked. It didn't work in any game. I just tried to say, it worked in game 2. It didn't work in game 2 because Karras came off the bench in game 2. That didn't work, and he just kept getting out-coached by Thibodeau in every facet. And a lot of that was because Thibodeau trusted his guys to execute, and JB didn't. I think another thing that JB did that was really frustrating was that he didn't really know who to rely on, and he tried to rely on Rubio, which no, we've already gone up that small little hill, and that was not great. And then he tried to rely on Danny Green, even though he barely played Green in the regular season. So Green is a good player. I was glad that he got out on the floor, but he didn't have. You just bypassed Dean Wade, Lamar Stevens. Heck, even Isaiah Mobley got more face time with these current starters than Danny Green. And I just think that ultimately JB blinked. And I think that the organization honestly has to have a serious conversation with what they should do with him. Because something that my brother brought up with me, he and I talk a lot about this team, is when you're a small market organization and you think that you can go into the offseason and attract talent, but you've already publicly stated that that's difficult to do because that's why you traded for Donovan Mitchell. Your X factor has to be your coaching staff. Yes, you have to have talented players, but your coaches have to be even better than the larger market teams because your talent pool is different. It's not that it's worse, but you don't have the ability to say, oh, let's use the mid-level exception here and let's use it also on this guy. And we've gone through that as Cavs fans with all the stuff with LeBron. LeBron couldn't bring in free agents that were quality at times. So I think that they really need to figure out what to make of this coaching staff if they want to get the best talent out of this team.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I don't think it's a tough thing. I mean, blame. I hesitate to not put it on everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every player, every coach, everybody in the organization. I don't think that the Cavaliers, when they acquired Mitchell, I don't think they got very creative for the rest of the year about what they were going to do to build out this roster. And I think that when Kevin Love announced that he wanted to be traded, that blindsided the organization and the coaching staff. And now they were down a piece that they were going to rely on. And I firmly believe that. I think that they were trying to rest him for the regular season so they could use him now, the way that Miami's using him. And something that I just thought of when you were talking about the coaches is that at the start of the year, I remember that when we picked up Mitchell, in the first interview I heard Bickerstaff talk about it, he was saying, well, the only negative, and I don't know if he used that word, but the only negative was that they had schemed for guys they don't have now. And it was going to take a while for them to figure out how to scheme for the new people, which really it was just one guy. And I wonder if that is a little bit of a window into how JB works with his coaching staff. And that even what happens in the playoffs. Okay, so they come in with a very specific game plan, and it falls apart. But they don't seem to be a team that stops, drops, and rolls when that happens. They said at the beginning of the year they need time to think about how they want to use these guys. And so I think when they lost Love, I think they hoped Danny Green would come along quickly, but he couldn't get the minutes with this team that Love had. That wasn't going to happen. Love had worked with these guys for years. And now, all of a sudden, the depth that we thought we had on our bench, because Rubio didn't come along, and because Jetty was underused for half of the season, and because Lamar Stevens is, favored and then not, and then favored and then not. I mean, that's where I pick on the coaches. They did not prepare these players to be able to be the next person up when the people that they were relying on had off nights. And it just so happened that our guards, our star guards, our all-star guards were non-existent in 3 straight games. Well, how do you scheme for that? On a team that really you don't have the depth anyway, but you don't have coaching staff that's thinking about using depth. So I don't disagree with you. But then on the other side, the players didn't show up, and the coaches didn't have a lot of choice down the bench at that point. It's tough to assign blame when it feels like everyone could have been better. And therefore, that's my expectation now going into next year. I want this team just losing sleep every night. Everybody that works for the Cavs, whether they're the ball boy all the way up to the manager's office and, you know, into the marketing department and down into the locker room, I want everybody to feel a pit in their stomach until they're back in this situation again next year, and then they can prove to themselves and the rest of the country that they deserved to be here, because we know they did. But now they've done kind of the worst thing possible that you can do to a fan base, which is think that, oh, you're good in the regular season.
Right.
And, you know, honestly, I was saying this to a coworker the other day, like, these things make me feel like the regular season should be shortened. Because what is the point? If we were the best fourth quarter team in the league and we had all these come from behind games and all this stuff, but we had so many particular flaws all year long that you can survive in a regular season, but you can't survive them in the playoffs. And that's exactly why we died so quickly.
I totally agree with you that everybody has blame to go around. And I think that the players and the coaching staff especially would agree with you on that. I just think that in what I'm hearing from other folks in talking about and how they're discussing this team, they're looking at, okay, how does this team move forward? And for me, I agree with that mentality of like, okay, you know, the best way to move forward is with the talent on this roster because it's so young and their ceiling is so high. I just think that with this series, I question some of the decision making around how to fully implement that talent. Specifically, you look at, we know that Isaac Okoro is up and down, but Okoro played actually pretty well in Game 5, and I think that you and I would say, yeah, he hasn't done everything that we've wanted him to do, but we'd also agree that the coaching staff hasn't done him any favors in certain scenarios.
No, they haven't believed in him enough for him to be successful.
Yeah. So that's where I kind of get into this situation where mentally the gymnastics of when is the right time, and I don't have to make this decision, and you don't either, luckily.
Right.
But there is a decision and a crossroads where I honestly think that JB is going to be on an extremely short leash because if Okoro comes out again and he looks just as tentative as he does offensively at times this next season, that's on the coaching staff.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
For me, there's a level of, basically I would say that JB in my mind is on notice. The rest of the guys, I agree, should lose sleep. But I wouldn't put a lot of these players on notice. Maybe some of the role players, because that's what happens in the offseason. Like, I'm not targeting anyone. I'm just saying that just happens. But yeah, I would say, you know, the term, he's on thin ice. Just because it is tough to say, like, okay, well, we know that we have all this youth and we know we have all this talent. Right. Well, let's see Mobley be even better offensively. Let's see some offensive sets that bring other talent that's young out onto the floor, because that would be helpful.
And I don't, I guess that the question to me is about blame, and I have a hard time pointing the blame solely on him. But as far as him being in the hot seat the most, because, you know, you can't really get rid of anybody else as easily, and you don't really want to yet. And I understand the fan base, we talked about it at the top. The fan base is talking about Allen being traded, but that's, you know, that's just emotions getting the better of people right now. And not understanding that, you know, maybe Allen just needs to be utilized in a different way, and that maybe this year that's my biggest complaint overall, that the coaching staff did not, and JB's the leader of that, right? But they did not guide these players through the regular season to be prepared for this series. And there was nothing more glaring of that until we saw the series happen. And
Yeah.
ultimately, I think back now to all of these regular season wins and these, fun games and all this stuff, and really we should have lost those games. It would have been more valuable to the learning experience of the players. Instead, the coaching staff was trying to win games, and I think that this year should have been more about winning or losing. What did you learn? How did you grow? And are you prepared for that next level that nobody gets to see until the playoffs begin, because the regular season's so watered down that, great for you. Go play hero ball and win all the fourth quarters. But you just got humiliated in 5. So,
Adam, this season's done. We've started packing our bags, but let's go on an oldie but a goodie topic for a minute here. If Kevin Love had decided to not ask for a buyout, would the Cavs have won this series?
I think, what is the term? I think I buried the lead already. I think if you've listened to the other parts of the episode. I think that we would have had a better chance, but I think it goes back to the conversation we just had at question 1, which is, what were the coaches planning for? What were their expectations for going into the playoffs? And I think I'll never forget how the week before Altman is going in front of the national media going, no, everybody's happy. We're happy. Love's happy. No one's going anywhere. We're great. And then Love, a week later is like, I want to trade. What? He blindsided the organization. He blindsided the coaching staff. And then he went and had a conversation with Fedor after he went down to Miami. He was like, oh, yeah, I never talked to anybody about it. I didn't really know what their plans were for me. I just kind of emotionally reacted. Okay, thanks, Kev. I'm glad you're still in the playoffs with Miami, playing with your guys. Wait, no. No, your guys are home now for the rest of the season. I hope it hurt you to watch us play the way we did against the Knicks. I mean, I like Kevin for the things he contributed to the team when he could, when he was out there playing. And I know that if he could have been out there more, he would have, right? I don't think it's ever been about effort for the guy. But he left a bad taste in my mouth by leaving the way that he did, and by nobody kind of realizing how much he screwed over the team. And acting like the team somehow did it to him first. He had a bad back and a bad thumb. And yet, you get down to Miami and those things don't hurt so much. What's going on with you? So, okay, maybe we wouldn't have won anything with him still on the team, but just knowing that the coaching staff had to have been planning for him in that way, and knowing that this coaching staff doesn't really pivot to new ideas very quickly, when Danny Green couldn't get any meaningful time with the roster before the playoffs began, they didn't have any way to scheme anything for him. So we were all of a sudden without a veteran playoff experienced person that could come in off the bench and some nights maybe even score 20-25 for you because of the threes that he rains down. Yeah, we missed that, I think. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know if we would have... Heck, we might have been swept with him because defensively he was so deficient that the things that the coaching staff was asking Allen and Mobley to do, Kevin Love wasn't going to do. And I think the Knicks the Knicks were so in charge of this series on so many levels that it is difficult to say. I do agree with you that his shooting probably would have helped because I doubt that for 5 games, Love's percentage would have been very poor. But I also looked back at his usage in the play-in last year, and in one game he's got over 20 minutes, and the other game I think it was under 10. And so again, it goes back to, for me, JB is just not... something's up. He's blinking in this scenario when it comes to postseason play, and he might have played Love for 6 minutes.
He would have gotten Rubio's minutes.
Right. And speaking of Rubio, the coaching staff, I think, is competent on some levels, but something is odd about them because I was listening to Fedor's podcast, and he mentioned that in spite of the fact that Rubio was playing in the playoffs, there were coaches on the staff saying to Rubio, encouraging him to play this summer in the Spanish league, for the Spanish team. And I just found that really strange. So Rubio's getting weird messages because, you think that my legs aren't under me, but you're still giving me minutes. And I could see where Love, I'm not giving him a pass on how he reacted, but I could see where Love was like, wait, you're giving me minutes, but then all of a sudden you're shutting me down. So there's definitely some weird, odd communication style.
Yeah, he didn't talk to them and they didn't talk to him. So, yeah, there's definitely some odd communication going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Love would have helped a little bit, but I think we still would have lost in 5.
The other X factor for me is something that Garland mentioned at the top of the year, which is that Kevin Love was one of the best cheerleaders and kind of player coaches on the sideline for him over the years that he'd been there. And even when Kevin left, that was my first thought. Like, oh, great. Garland just lost his mentor that he relies to point things out on the court and go, hey, don't let him do this or come around this screen or do this stuff, right? And so now that's gone. That's gone. That wasn't there for the entire playoffs. And yeah, I'm sure there's other guys that can do it too. But Garland mentioned the value of that. And so I have to feel that it was actually missing for him when he needed it. And that's where I think it's hard for us to understand the value of a person being there or not. Because we can say minutes or stats, but it's also about what they're doing in the locker room, what they're doing on the bench, what they're doing in practices. And he left the team, left them to themselves. And it seemed like they needed a big brother. They needed some guidance through this series. And I think you're right. I think they probably still would have lost it because everything we've covered before, they were totally unprepared, really, in the end, to mature enough in the ways that they needed to compete in this series. But I think it could have gone 6 or 7, maybe. You know, it's hard to imagine that it would have played out this way if they could have just done a few things just a little differently. I mean, even in an alternate reality, you know, they at least won game 4 or game 3 or something. You know, like this series was maddening because both teams shot very poorly, and there were only a few statistics that the Knicks beat us out in, and yet we were crushed on the points side. You know, so it looked like they dominated us across the board, but when you looked at the stats, it's like, well, this was in hand. We could have won these games if we had played the way that we are capable of.
The final seconds.
Well, now that the season has ended in a dumpster fire of a playoff series, what are your expectations for next year?
I think we've touched base on a lot of those things in this episode. Coaching, I think, needs to improve. They need to consider, I think, a little more of the talent that they have on this team, and that there are certain players that, like Allen, I think, even, could average a lot more in any statistic, really. I think that we've got a lot of superstars on this team, or potential superstars on this team, but they're deferring to one another to kind of take that role. And I think maybe because Mitchell is the star player that he is, and Garland is the star player that he's been becoming the star player that he was projected to be, that others that have been more role players on other teams and now that are on the Cavs are kind of coming in and deferring and saying, okay, it's you guys, and then I'll just figure it out after that. And I think there has to be some nights that we see people besides Mitchell and Garland dominate off the ball. They need to be able to score and rebound and assist and do all those things without those two guards being a pivotal thing every night. And I'd love to see that. The potential there with Allen and Mobley and possibly Isaiah Mobley coming in. that's still great. So I think right now we're pretty solid with at least 4 out of the 5, and even with Okoro in the starting 5, if they could give him a little more time to mature and get comfortable there. Something that Mike Zavigno reported on Twitter, that wonderful place, said that the Cavs' most used regular season lineup was Garland, Mitchell, Okoro, Mobley, and Allen. That lineup played 800 possessions together, 344 more than any other grouping, and had a plus 7.8 net rating. JB played that lineup for just 45 possessions in the series. I don't know if people understand how little that is. It had a plus 11.4 net rating. So that really reinforces a lot of what you've said tonight. But but I would say that, ultimately it also comes down to the coaching staff not believing in who's on the bench. And some of that goes to the front office and getting them the pieces that they actually want to use. And why bring in Raul Neto if you're not going to use them? Why bring in these players if they're just going to, fill in a roster spot only when you need people to come in and contribute? So I think that the front office has to do the best job possible to round out this roster so that the coaches have nowhere to hide. And if they can't win with an improved roster for this team, then I think most of the coaches should go.
Yeah, I think my expectations are they need to utilize the youth and develop those players in a way that actually makes this offense hum. I think that there have been too many times where you were mentioning earlier in the episode how we were like, wow, they came back and they finally, lit the Nets on fire with 3 minutes left. And I know that that's going to happen during the regular season. And I think that this Cavs team might still hang their hat on that type of mentality. But the offense needs to hum at times. And I don't think that really was the case at all during the entire season. I think that they have really good offensive talent, but they need to be able to utilize them better. And I think it goes to what you were mentioning too, where we know that they have an Isaiah Mobley coming up. We know that they have a Sam Merrill, also who was in the G League as well. And those are guys who can shoot it from the outside, who have had success in college. So, I would like to see either them or other players fill out the roster at the end of the bench a little bit more and get utilized more. And then, like what you mentioned, have Kobe focus on an actual backup point guard, an actual backup big that they can play and not be terrified to play them. The last 2 seasons, the backup bigs that they've had, for whatever reason, the coaching staff has just not trusted them. And I need them to go out and get these players where there's no excuse to not trust them. A dude who is maybe only 27 who has been a proven player, unlike who they've had in the past couple of years. And I agree with that sentiment. Then that way it's like, all right, we gave you all the toys that you wanted. Well, let's not. Okay, you can't then just throw them all in the trash. Like, you gotta actually use them. And I think the other expectation I have for this roster and this team is to proceed past the first round of the playoffs.
Yes.
This Eastern Conference is going to be brutal again. It is a very tough conference. And the Cavs are going to have to show even more grit and determination. And that's just that it has to, their goal and their mindset needs to be to not be embarrassed in the postseason again. First, make the postseason and then not get embarrassed.
Thank you for listening to the Cavaliers Basketball Club podcast. Let's go Cavs!